Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Child Early and Forced Marriage webinar series. We're delighted to welcome today Dr. Quentin Wodon from the World Bank Group. And I'll go ahead and start by introducing our moderator for today. So the moderator is Sushmita Mukherjee. Welcome, Sushmita. Sushmita is Director of Gender and Adolescent Girls at Project Concern International. She has been doing multiple interventions and studies to understand the normative structuring of child marriage in different societies in India and designing different solutions to address these as well. So welcome, Sushmita. Thank you for agreeing to moderate today.
Thank you, Mahi. Thank you, Quentin, to be here. And we are all delighted on behalf of the group to have you here and present your study here. So for the benefit of the recording and also for all the other guests around, I would like to mention that Quentin Wodon is a lead economist at the World Bank's Education Global Practice. He previously managed the World Bank's unit on faith and development, served as its lead poverty specialist for Africa, and worked as an economist and senior economist for Latin America. He has taught at the University of Namur American University and Georgetown University. He has authored more than 500 publications, and his research has been covered by major news outlets. He has served as associate editor for journals and as president of the Society of Government Economists and Association for Social Economics. Wodon, who was trained in business engineering, worked in market research and as a brand assistant or brand manager for Procter & Gamble before shifting his career path nearly 30 years ago to join ATD Fourth World, a nonprofit working with the extreme poor. In his free time, he volunteers with nonprofits and in Rotary, where he has served in leadership locally and globally. He holds a PhD in economics, environmental science, health science, and theology. Wow. It's an amazing, Quentin, to be having you around to talk about your subject on the economics of child marriage. And the stage is yours. Over to you. And we are here to learn from you and hearing you. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Sushmita. I don't know where you found that old bio. Now I've tried to put that much shorter. Anyway, it's embarrassing. So I would have to share some of the work we have done over the last few years on the economic cost of child marriage. The initial study was with RCOW, and I see Susan, who is there, Petroni, who was directing on the side of RCOW, and I was directing on the side of the World Bank, that initial global study. We have done work in many countries since, and we continue to do work which is somewhat related, not only us, of course, but many, many other people. Actually, today I was listening to a very interesting webinar, which I think is going to be publicly available on what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and some analysis there related mostly to schooling, but also indirectly to child marriage and girls' education. So I think I have about 20 minutes to go through a presentation, if that's right, Sushmita, so that we have about half an hour for questions. So you want me to go for about 20 minutes, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So let me try to share my screen. And what I'm going to do is to run you as an example through one of the more recent studies that we did, which is for Sierra Leone, and we have done that for many countries now over the last 3 or 4 years. The title of the presentation is Educating Girls and Ending Child Marriage for Sierra Leone, and the presentation today is adapted from economic update for the country that was actually finalized in July 2020, so about 1 year ago. So the context is the one that you know. And this is a slide from the original study, actually the global study. Child marriage and girls' education are often seen as social as opposed to economic issues. When we started the work with our CRW on trying to compute the economic cost of child marriage, one of the main aims that we had was to make an investment case for ending child marriage. There was already at the time a lot of consensus and movement to act. I mean, ending child marriage is part of the SDGs, and the African Union had a campaign, but governments were not doing a lot specifically about child marriage. So the study that we started was really about the economic impacts. And after that global study, and for most of the country studies, we went much more in depth into what can we actually do. And I'm going to talk about what we can do to end child marriage. There are many things that we can do, but I think there is one thing in particular that we need to do. And what is particularly interesting, and this is very new, and I'll talk about that too, is new data that we have for 10 West African countries, which are actually the countries with the highest rates of child marriage for some of them, that tells us a little bit more how much the link, how strong the link is between child marriage and girls' education. All right, so enough for background. This is on this slide, a slide with data on trends in child marriage. And I like to show this graph where we have estimates of child marriage for different regions of the world over time to make 2 points. The first point is that it's actually feasible to reduce child marriage, defined as a formal or informal union before the age of 18. It's feasible to reduce it, and South Asia, and in particular India, is a good example of that with a rapidly declining prevalence of child marriage. At the same time, in some other regions, in particular Latin America and the Caribbean, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, which has higher levels of child marriage, things have been moving very, very slowly. And nowadays, the highest rates are found, especially in West Africa and especially in the Sahel. It's actually a priority of the World Bank to try to reduce child marriage, improve girls' education, and the two, for me, go hand in hand. The message that you have at the bottom of the slide is that to try to end child marriage, you need to have a viable alternative. You need to have something else that is an option for the girls, and the best option is typically being in school. So I'll pass on Ebola. The framework that we are using nowadays for both the education of girls and ending child marriage is adapted from that global study with RCRW, whereby we look at the potential impact of girls' education on child marriage and on early childbearing. Early childbearing is defined as having a first child before the age of 18. But we also look at the impact of both education for girls and either child marriage and early childbearing at a range of other domains: earnings and status of living, fertility and population growth, health, nutrition and well-being, agency and decision-making, and even social capital in institutions. And once we have some of those impacts, we try to put a cost estimate on those, the different categories of cost or benefits from ending child marriage or educating girls, and in turn that helps to reduce poverty, for example, and reduce also inequality. So we have different relationships, and as I have only 20 minutes today, I'm not going to go into the details of the framework for the economic cost, but the idea is that you have different pathways. So for example, child marriage can affect early childbearing. We find in most countries that about 2/3 of the girls who give birth before the age of 18, they do so because they were married, or at least the timing of both the marriage and the timing of the birth of the first child suggests that marriage happened first. Early childbearing itself has an impact on early childhood development and a range of indicators for under 5 children, like mortality or stunting. Child marriage, on the other hand, can have an impact on agency, including contraceptive use. It has a strong impact on fertility and population growth. It has an impact on education, which also affects fertility. And then all of those different things lead to different welfare losses. And when we try to compute some of those costs, we try to be a bit broad, but at the same time, we also try to avoid double counting, which can happen. If we look here at losses in earnings, so for example, child marriage will affect fertility. Fertility may affect labor force participation. Child marriage affects education and attainment almost directly. And then both labor force participation and education attainment affect losses in earnings. And so you have to take into account those different channels. So what were the conclusions? And I'm going to frame it a bit more in terms of education than child marriage, but you will see why later. I will link the two back together. So we find, if I take the question of the benefits from girls' education, which I believe is the best way to end child marriage, we find that, of course, education matters especially for girls. It matters for boys too, but it matters especially for girls precisely because of the link between educational attainment, being on school or not, with child marriage and early childbearing, right? And we find that typically in most countries, these are estimates for Sierra Leone, but each year of additional secondary education that you get reduces the risk of child marriage and reduces the risk of early childbearing. And practically speaking, in many countries, if we were ensuring universal secondary education for girls, we could almost end child marriage, and we would reduce early childbearing by about 2/3. Now, that's the case in Sierra Leone. That's not the case necessarily everywhere, especially for early childbearing. But still, if there is any one big intervention or way to end child marriage and reduce early childbearing, is to try to keep the girls in school. Of course, we also need to ensure that the girls who are married or who have a child can remain in school. Now, a second key finding is very, very important when we think about education. It is that primary schooling is necessary, but not sufficient. And so when we did the study with RCRW, the focus was on the impact of child marriage, and then for some indicators, the impact of early childbearing, right? So if we want, for example, to look at under 5 mortality and under 5 stunting, we look at early childbearing. If we want to look at fertility, we look at we could look at early childbearing, but we look at child marriage and so on. Now, after that, we did another study on the cost of not educating girls, where we were looking more at education. And what we found is that for virtually all of the indicators that we looked at, and we have about 20 of those, primary schooling is of course necessary, but not sufficient. And in most cases, primary schooling has very little benefit for the girls. And the whole issue is at the secondary level. You need to get to secondary schooling to have higher earnings, to have lower infant mortality or infant mortality, et cetera, et cetera. So on fertility, and now in each time we do those studies at the country level, we kind of showcase both the impact of girls' education and the impact of ending child marriage or ending early childbearing, right? So in this case, it was for Sierra Leone, universal secondary education could reduce total fertility by 13%. And in addition, if we were ending child marriage, we would have a reduction of 8%. So, I mean, we do this through regressions. In this case, it's Poisson regressions. It doesn't really matter. But we have education on the right-hand side as exploratory variables. We have child marriage, especially exactly when the girls got married. And then we have a number of controls. And so we see both impacts from education and from child marriage on fertility. Fertility is the one indicator where it's really across the board in all of the countries with fairly similar levels of marginal impacts, different levels of total impact from universal secondary education, because the countries are at different levels in terms of how many girls reach secondary education, and same for child marriage, but the marginal impacts are very similar across countries. Health, in this case, we found that achieving universal secondary education and ending child marriage would improve child health as well as women's health, and we have different indicators of women's health. Work, so typically we find that educational attainment as well as child marriage don't necessarily have a very strong effect on labor force participation, but they have a very large effect on earnings. And again, this was for Sierra Leone. It's the same in most of the countries. We just got, again, as I mentioned, data for 10 countries in West Africa. We did all the regressions, similar kind of findings. Primary education does not bring you much, frankly. Maybe 10, 20, 30% more earnings than if you have no education at all. And that's related in part to the low quality of education systems. But secondary education enables you to earn up to twice as much, right? And of course, tertiary, much more. Agency, we have different measures, and we found some impacts of child marriage or early childbearing, not systematic, but enough to say that there is an impact, even though that impact is not necessarily always very large. The impact of education is typically larger. There's a note on social capital there, and it's a finding that I find personally very interesting, is that the ability to engage in altruistic behaviors, volunteering, donating to charity, helping strangers, all of that is also related to the educational level. It doesn't mean at all, of course, that better educated people are more altruistic. No, it simply means that they are in a position in life where they can engage in such behaviors like donating to charity more than others. So virtually everything that we looked at, either through girls' education or through child marriage or through early childbearing, we find those effects. Now, these are just correlations based on regression analysis. It's not an impact study, but it's very convincing. So what are the costs? What we found in many countries is that the largest cost, economic cost, of child marriage, and this is for child marriage as opposed to education, but the same reasoning applies. But for child marriage, the largest economic cost is through fertility and population growth. And the basic argument is that if the families or if the woman can delay childbearing, then they will have a smaller number of children over their lifetime. That reduces population growth, which then increases standards of living, at least for a while, for a 15, 20 years period, because GDP per capita will be higher. So this is based on GDP per capita, but even at the household level, it would to some extent hold. We also find an effect on earnings, and the effect of child marriage on earnings is through its effect on education. And in this case, it was $71 million. That's an estimate of how much women today would earn more if none of them had married as a child before. And then we have a number of other benefits as well, but I'm going to pass on those. One interesting one is budget savings for the state, which relates again to lower population growth. Now, we had 5 or 6 categories of costs. We don't compute other types of costs that could be resulting from child marriage or from a lack of education. So in many ways, those are underestimates. Now, what we try to do in all of the studies that we're doing at the country level or regional level now is to share suggestions for what can be done. And one of the examples that I like is an intervention by the Center for Girls' Education in Nigeria. And they actually have done now an RCT, and they have preliminary results which are outstanding. But the idea was that the intervention combined the idea of safe space, where girls and women, could learn about life skills, sexual reproductive health, and so on, with an intervention and a stipend for them to remain in school. And there was a very good dialogue with the communities where they were intervening to get consensus on that. And the safe space plus with the economic incentive is what really helps. Now, we did a literature review. There have been new ones since then. And Dave Evans has done a more detailed one. He was talking about it this morning at that meeting on the Democratic Republic of Congo. But it's interesting that he said exactly what we said. So we were looking at 3 types of interventions. The safe space kind of intervention with sexual and reproductive health knowledge and life skills, that plus economic opportunities, or that plus incentive for schoolings. And we found that the one intervention that was the most likely to actually delay marriage and delay childbirth while also getting the girls in school was when you have economic incentives. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do the rest. And I was very convinced by the discussion that I was listening to this morning on the DRC, where people were arguing, well, we need to do different things. And I fully agree, you need to do different things, and I'll come back to that. But in terms of the RCTs overall, it seems that the incentives for schooling and keeping the girls in school are probably the best way to delay childbirth and delay the age of marriage. I'll pass by on those 3 slides to save a bit of time. So what we typically say to countries, but of course with variations depending on the country, and I'll get back to those variations, is that if you want to improve girls' education, and if girls' education is indeed one of the best ways to delay marriage and childbearing, you need to have a number of basic conditions in place. I mean, you need to have schools, it needs to be affordable, the kids need to learn in school. Learning is very important. I'll give you some examples. And this was a presentation for Sierra Leone, so we emphasize the fact that they had just lifted a ban on pregnant girls returning to schools that they had when we presented this to them several months ago. But you also need targeted interventions, and beyond safe spaces, which have lots of advantages, the literature seems to suggest that incentives to remain in school is the key. And then you need to have efforts to change gender-based social norms, but that's still a literature that is building up, and we have fewer examples of successful interventions, although that may change in the future. Now, when we talk about the schooling of girls, and again, I do believe that keeping the girls in schools is the best, between quote, viable alternative to child marriage. We have this little framework where we look at, I realize it's in French because I copied it from a presentation I made yesterday for Benin. But the first take is that you need to have capacity of the schooling system and accessibility. The schools need to be not too far, or you need to have transport, or you need to have another way for the girls to be able to go to school. Niger has an interesting program where, for example, girls live in another family that has a school. It's actually fairly affordable. So first you need to have capacity and accessibility. Then you need to have affordability from a cost point of view and from a social norms point of view. And this takes into account the direct and opportunity cost of schooling. We need to have also safety, and we are doing now, hopefully we'll release it in July, a new global study on ending violence in schools, what's the cost of violence in school, but also what you can do to make schools safer. Typically, we don't have a lot of data apart from school health surveys on this. And so this is an area that we have to dig a bit more into. Learning is key, and I'll explain why in a bit. And you know that in many of the countries where the prevalence of child marriage is very high, learning poverty, which is defined as the share of the children of 10 years old who can actually read and understand an age-appropriate text, is very high too. In Africa, almost 9 in 10 children age 10 cannot read and understand an age-appropriate text, right? So that's also a key reason for dropout. And then when you drop out, you're more likely, again, to get married. And then you have the last bucket, which is inclusion and alternatives programs, second chance programs for girls who may have dropped out. So we have that little framework. This I'll pass on. And maybe since I didn't put my slide on the framework, let me say that in words. Something that I found very interesting that we are finalizing now, based on data from 10 countries from YMU. So these are West African countries. So it's a very simple question that is asked at various levels of schooling, or we can compute the responses to those questions at various levels of schooling. So we are asking the parents, but why did your girl drop out of school? And the cool thing about that survey, apart from the fact that we have comparable data for 10 countries, which is cool, is the fact that they had very detailed potential answers to that question: why did your child never go to school, or why did your child not continue schooling, drop out, right? And they, for example, in the dropout, there are 17 modalities, and so we can regroup them by big categories. So we know some modalities that relate to accessibility, right? The school is too far, or the child has an handicap, which is often related to accessibility. It's difficult for the child to go to the school. We have information on both the out-of-pocket cost and the cost, the opportunity cost, right? While we prefer that the child go working, for example, right? And so on. We have a few questions that relate to social norms, including the issue of child marriage or an early pregnancy. We have questions about, well, the child failed, the child did not learn enough, did not pass the exam, etc. And so we can actually look at each level of the progression of the child through the education system. When does the child drop out first? And second, why, according to the parents. And what was very interesting, and I didn't have data like that before to make that point as strongly, is social norms matter. There's no doubt that social norms matter. But opportunity cost matters, and learning matters. And here, what's happening is that when you look at where is the largest number of dropouts, it's before completing primary. And then it's before completing lower secondary. And then it is at upper secondary level where many girls actually can get married. But so what happens is that many girls drop out at the beginning, especially in primary, because of the lack of learning, because of the low quality of the schools. They fail exams, or they drop out because they were not learning anything. What that means is that if we were solving the issue of learning in primary school, improving learning performance, we would have a much larger cohort that would go up, right? Now, the issue of social norms matter much more at the upper secondary level, right? And that's when parents may want their girls to be married, for example, right? But it matters, it's a higher percentage of the dropouts at that level, but that applies to a fairly small number of girls, at least in those countries, compared to the very large number of girls that drop out at the primary level, right? Because it thins out very, very quickly. And so these data are very useful, and we are now doing simulations with those data on trying to figure out, okay, what would happen if we were improving learning in terms of the overall educational attainment of girls versus what would happen if we were going to solve the opportunity cost, and then what would happen if we solve the social norms or the access to school. And there are huge differences between the different countries, right? And even in a country like Niger, where social norms are so strong, you find actually that learning, according to the parents, is really a key driver for the girls to drop out. The lack of learning, the fact that they don't pass exams and things like that. So anyway, I think I've been 3 minutes above my 20. I've used 23 minutes. I'm going to go to my last slide. We have a very strong economic case for investing in the education of girls and ending child marriage. Ending child marriage in turn would help reduce a lot of the early childbearing, not all of it, but quite a bit of it. And that proportion depends quite a bit on the country. Like it's very high in many countries. It's a bit lower, for example, in Liberia, even in Sierra Leone, and so on. And then we have quite a few solutions. But on the solutions, and maybe I'll take 1 more minute on that, I think we have to be very careful. I think we have to give a message that is based in part on the review of the RCTs and the literature and all of that. And that review suggests that what seems to work best is actually the economic incentive, reducing the opportunity cost or reducing the direct cost of going to school, right? But we also need the rest, the social norms, the learning, many different dimensions. And in some cases, we need to change the law in countries, right? So there are a few countries, for example, that were preventing girls from married girls or pregnant girls from being in school. So I think we have to kind of use that literature review, if you will, with the common sense. And then the nice thing is that in some cases, like for these 10 countries, we also now have direct perceptions of households as to why both boys and girls drop out. And it's very different depending on which country you're talking about, right? And so we have to be always anchoring the solution that we suggest to the local context. I mean, it's obvious that I'm saying that, right? But often you don't have the data. And you might do qualitative work, it helps, but you're not fully sure because is the qualitative work representative, for example? But for example, in Benin, what we found, and I shared that yesterday to people there, is that the opportunity cost is really, really key, right? In Niger, what we find is that the learning and the lack of learning in school is really, really key, right? And so depending on what you find in different countries, you may suggest a a slight different mix in terms of the package of interventions. I've used 25 minutes. Let me stop and go for any questions and comments or rejoinders or critique of what I said. Thank you.
Thanks, Quentin. I think that was a very nice glimpse, I would say, because there is so much to understand at each and every slide that you have presented. I would now welcome the participants here to ask questions, clarifications, many things. So participants can unmute themselves and ask direct questions.
Hi, sure, I'll jump in.
Sure.
Suzanne Petroni, and thanks, Quentin, for mentioning that the project started as a joint project with ICRW. And it's wonderful to see how much work you've done since then, taking the basic information and applying it to different countries and with solutions, which I know countries were very interested in. I want to ask about two other possible connections and whether you looked into them, particularly in West Africa, but other countries as well. Education, clearly, we know that it brings so many valuable things to girls and their families and their communities. But one of the barriers to keeping girls in school is that there's a lack of job opportunities for them when they graduate. It doesn't matter if you keep them in school. Well, it matters, but one of the challenges that we have seen for keeping them in school is that their families don't see the value. You talked about the opportunity cost, but for families, a lot of them make it the calculation that if we can only keep one child in school, it's better to keep the boy because he has options after graduating. And we know that in many cases girls don't. So did you look into that as a potential driver? And then the second one, you talked about the importance of changing the laws to allow pregnant or parenting girls to stay in school. And that's very significant in many countries. But what about as a solution, providing sexual and reproductive health information, comprehensive sexuality education, so that they don't get pregnant either outside of marriage, or if they are married, that they can delay their pregnancy until they graduate school. Have you looked into that and the cost benefit value of those services and that information in order to delay pregnancy and delay marriage?
Right. So both points are very good, right? The issue of the job opportunities for women and for men is a key driver of dropouts when you have few of those opportunities. So there are different angles to that. I mean, what we haven't done on our side technically is to see, for example, whether we could have some measure of economic opportunities at the local level, and we could think about that, for example, with that 10 surveys, because that's 10 countries, so it's a large data set, so it's a bit easier to see things. So we haven't looked at whether economic opportunity at the local level affects controlling for other things, both educational attainment and the decision to marry, right? I mean, the issue is that controlling for other things is complicated because we cannot really control easily for the quality of education at those levels. But still, I mean, there might be a way to do that. But I think there's a consensus that one of the reasons why people drop out, and girls in particular drop out and then marry, is that there's not enough opportunities. One thing interesting that is related to that, and that we find a very strong effects, and over 2 periods of time, is the relationship between the fact that you may have more women who are teachers, so the share of women among the teacher force at the local level, as well as whether you have women who are principals of schools. And we did detailed regression with PASEC, which is a student assessment data, again for West and some Central African countries, and now we have a few more. And we find in 2 years of data, 2014 and 2019, that the fact that you have a higher share of teachers who are women, or a higher share of principals who are women, that does improve learning, actually for boys and girls. And because learning is so important for boys and girls to remain in school, that then would have an effect on schooling. The reason why it relates a little bit to what you were saying, Susan, is because they also serve as role model for girls, right? So on learning itself, we don't see necessarily a differential in terms of the effect, but on schooling, there might be an effect. We haven't been able to test for that. And so it's part of that whole aspect that you need also role model women in positions of responsibility, and one of them would be the teacher or the school principal, and that would be very visible to the girls, to show that the girls can actually continue to stay in school and have a job prospect after, right? And in several countries, we are discussing whether there are ways for governments to increase the share of women who are teachers and the share of women who are principals. I mean, we're talking about countries here where, on average, about 20% of the teachers are women. It changes quite a bit between the countries, right? But the women teachers are a small minority, actually, right? So I mean, I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's an indirect answer to your question. And then the other one on the sexual and reproductive health information. So my understanding of the literature, but that dates back to 2 or 3 years back, and there may be new studies, is that there are lots of benefits to that, but that alone does not necessarily lead to delaying marriage or even delaying childbearing. And so what I can say from the World Bank point of view is that my colleagues from the health, nutrition, and population practice are trying to put together a package of interventions for school health, for schools. And that's one of the elements of that package. There are other elements in that package, and then I'm trying to help them to build a tool that people can use to simulate some of the costs and some of the impacts of that. So we are all convinced that this is needed, but whether that by itself would delay marriage, my limited understanding of the literature is that it's not completely clear, right? There may be cases, yes, but there may be also many cases where it didn't make that much of a difference. But it's certainly something that has to be provided because it has a bunch of other benefits, even if it doesn't delay child marriage or early childbearing directly. Yeah.
Great. So then you have a follow-up question?
No, just wanted to say thank you for that. I may come back if there's more time.
Thank you. So maybe, Quentin, I would also like to ask, like, continuing with the Susan's question, you had one component of parents and communities, and I'm coming from a very Indian perspective. Even if your daughter is in school, the role that community plays in pressurizing parents, that actually, and then if you are deviating from that normative behavior, then you are socially excluded, and which is in itself is a big punishment. So is there any way that we can look into of parents' aspirations, which can be really strong and defeating the entire pressure? How does that can be, like, any of your experience suggestions? And just one more question is that it is always good. We all work with girls and females and all those things, and you spoke about their role models. I was also wondering, I think at the rural and the community areas, even boys also do not have the right role model to really see that, yes, they have to pursue a different kind of life where, their aspirations should be different. So is there anything that you would like to highlight from that perspective as well?
Right. I mean, on the first question, right? I mean, when I emphasized the fact that incentives to keep girls in school seem to be, according to the literature, the best way to improve educational attainment, and also one of the best ways to reduce child marriage. I mean, this is what we see from RCTs, That doesn't mean it's the only thing to do, right? We are very clear on that, right? And I think that many of the interventions that the bank is implementing in different countries or others, right, emphasize social norms. And it may be that we will have in a few years many more evaluations on how social norms interventions actually work, right? And they may work very well. But my understanding is that right now we don't have that much, right, on that. Now, there was a discussion that I was part of a few years ago. It was 2 or 3 years ago, which I found fascinating. And it was Erika Fields. She was presenting early results from an impact evaluation in Bangladesh, right? Which is not the same as India, but there are some commonalities, right, in terms of the social norms pressure. And they had a program that was providing food, actually, rather than cash, and they found a very large reduction in child marriage in the treatment areas, right? And then somebody asked why, because the question was asked, why does it work? Because the cash transfer, sorry, it wasn't a cash transfer, it was food, right? But the value of that was small, right? And was small in comparison, for example, to what the macro data suggests in terms of rising consumption, about improvements in standard of living over time, right? And so then people were suggesting that it worked because everybody in the area was benefiting from the program, and then the economic incentive, which may not need to be that large, right, was changing the dynamic and then changing the norm, the social norm, right? And so I think it's always important not to oppose the two, right? Not to say it's one versus the other, because when you implement something like that, an economic incentive for the girls to remain in school, that can actually change the social norm if everybody benefits it in the village, right? And then the pressure to get the girl married is reduced quite a bit, right? And I think we have to take this into account when we do our thinking. The implication of that, by the way, from my point of view, and that's one of the message we give to policymakers, is that if you're doing an intervention, right, don't do it nationally if you don't have a lot of money, where you have a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there. That is not going necessarily to change the social norms. Do it in the hotspots, right? And then go big there, because then if you reach enough girls, then you might change the norm, right? The economic incentive and the girls staying in school actually changes the social norm, right? And the pressure to marry. Anyway, I mean, it's just a conjecture. Now, on your other question as to, I mean, again, the opportunities for job and the opportunities for boys and the role models for boys. I mean, I haven't done anything on that, so I don't know what to say. I just know that the whole issue of providing, I mean, decent jobs is very complicated, right? But there are a number of interesting experiments, some with boys, some with girls, and we have to really think carefully about self-employment, right? And opportunities for very small micro enterprise and self-employment, because the formal sector in many of those countries is not going to change fundamentally anytime soon, right? I mean, in many countries, it's 5 or 10% of people in the formal sector, right? So we need to create the skills that people can do something and be small entrepreneurs, if you will. I mean, that's what I understand from my colleagues as well. So I don't know if I answered your questions, but these were the things that popped up to my mind. Yeah.
Hey, Quentin, may I ask you a question? And I feel like I can probably read a lot about this from various publications, especially because I'm not in the education sector, but very fascinating about the correlation between education and early marriage, of course, as I think has been shown for quite some time, but also from the recent data that you're explaining. I was just wondering about this idea of the Center for Girls Education in Nigeria, how you were saying the Safe Space Plus idea that also, you know, provided a stipend as an incentive to stay in school. Have you found similar correlations, for example, with income generation activities embedded into programs? Or for example, if schools are free, but really completely free without a need for uniforms or transport somehow, for example, if there's community schools, if they have, you know, quality provision of education, or other models. And again, if you want, you can also point me now or later to probably extensive literature in the education field about what works for secondary education, but I thought I'd ask.
Right. So the broad conclusion is that the interventions that have the largest effects, right, tend to be the ones that reduce the cost of schooling. Now, that could be a transfer, right? But that could be something else. It could be just making school free when it was not free, right? And things like that. So and there, I mean, I can share with you, if you send me an email, what we did a few years ago. But David Evans has done more detailed analysis since then, and what he presented this morning, he said the top 10 interventions are all essentially related to cost of schooling. What we did in the literature review that I did a few years ago was that we were looking at the impact of child marriage and early childbearing specifically, as opposed to just the impact on education, right? But we had the same conclusion. The conclusion was actually a ranking, if you will. We were suggesting that from what we saw, the incentives to remain in school tended to have the largest and more systematic effects on delaying marriage and childbearing. Second came income opportunities, right? Income generation activities. And third was programs that were providing, for example, safe spaces and SRH knowledge and things like that, but without any of the other two, right? And so, but to me, it makes sense, right? Because that you have to have something more, because you need to provide what I like to call a viable alternative to marriage, right? And that term viable alternative, I mean, I think I heard it first from Daniel Perlman, and Suzanne may remember, he was in one of our webinars that we organized on the study a few years ago, and he had spent a lot of time living in those villages. He has a research team living in the villages in Niger and Nigeria. And the question is really, what's the viable alternative? It's not that parents want to force the girls to marry. Some do, but that's not necessarily the norm. It's more that they don't know what to do and they want to protect the girls, and if they're not in school, then they feel that the girls will be protected if they are married, essentially, right? So again, income generating activities can work, but I think they work. So, I mean, we have great examples. Uganda is one, but what seems to work most of the time is ways to keep the girls in school. But I want to say also that, again, right? I mean, we have to be careful in our thinking, because here we are looking at interventions mostly for secondary schooling, practically, right? And typically for the upper secondary, right? But that's a very small group of girls in a way that can benefit from those interventions in those countries. And that doesn't mean that, for example, if we were improving learning in primary, we might get actually larger effects. We just have not tested that in an RCT, right? So we have to be careful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I missed some of the presentations, like for about 20 minutes, but I'll be able to engage in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jerome from ICBA.
Quentin, as a host, if you could
Thank you very much.
mute the.
Oh, you want me to try to mute them?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I muted them, I think. Yeah. It's true that I'm the host. I can give that back to you.
So maybe I'll read out the question from one of our from the chat, or Namrata, do you want to read it out on your own?
Oh, hi everyone. Happy to read out my question. I'm Namrata from the Center on Gender Equity and Health, UC San Diego. So I had been reading about climate change, like adverse weather events like drought or floods, in relation to child marriage, and how that was an adaptation strategy was what a lot of these articles were talking about. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this, or if you have studied it in your work. Thank you.
So I have a few things going on, not published, where we try to look at the impacts of different types of shocks. And I think we find, like many other people have found, that different types of negative shocks may increase the likelihood that girls get married, right? As between quote and adaptation strategy. So I think there's a lot of consensus that is happening. I mean, how large it is, that's a different story, right? I mean, when the COVID crisis hit, I mean, there were some estimates suggesting X million more girls getting married. It may be the case, it may not be the case. We don't really know, actually. We may start to know soon, but we don't really actually know. Those were all simulations based on a bunch of assumptions, which was needed at that time because there was no data. Now, so I mean, let me give you one example of a study that actually I have a meeting in 15 minutes about, where we are looking at West Africa and what's the impact of international migration within West Africa on both earnings and schooling, earnings for the migrants and then schooling for the children, right? We do find, although this is very preliminary, that migration tends to improve schooling for the very young children of the migrants, but actually not for the adolescent girls. And there may be a number of reasons for that. And that migration, by the way, is the result in many cases of either conflict or drought, right? So there's a lot of likelihood for different reasons that those shocks, both for the people at home and for the people who migrate, may increase, the risk for the adolescent girls of dropping out of school, but also of marrying, right? And we have some results like that. This is just one more contribution among many that suggests that this is indeed happening for different reasons. I mean, did I answer your question or not?
Yeah, yes, you did. Thank you.
Is there any other question? Because I heard Quentin has a meeting and we are almost near to finish our time. Any other member can unmute themselves if they have any last questions. Yes, Susan, just want to go back to concentrate. Yes, sure. So, Quentin, there is a lot of questions. For example, I would also, if I can ask a very last question, one of the methodological issue, thing that you are raising is that there's a cost to the entire problem. And you have identified in terms of monetary thing and other thing. What is your suggestion? Would you like to repeat this costing to really see if it has impacted when you showed your graph that the child marriage is declining and I think the major decline was in South Asia. So do you think such cost studies should be repeated at certain intervals to really demonstrate this relationship?
I mean, the cost study was not about that relationship, right? But I think that the cost study the costing was useful at a broad advocacy level, right? To make people realize, well, this has large economic cost, right? Child marriage has a large economic cost. And I think that we are still doing the study in different countries. So we did Mauritania this year, we did Benin, we did Sierra Leone. I forgot if we did another one, but each year we do between 3 and 5 new ones, right? And in those countries, it's useful because it helps for the advocacy, right? But I think what is much more important is the so what, right? Which is the thinking about the type of interventions. And within the thinking about the so what, it depends a little bit about where everybody is, right, in the chain, right? I mean, there's a role for the reviews of the literature review. Actually, there's a role for literature review and for reviews of literature reviews. That is true too, because they don't always say the same thing. But there's also, I think, a strong role for people who do work at the country level and know the conditions of the country in terms of what's happening. Because again, I mean, I don't think that the answer is necessarily the same everywhere, right? And the data that we got on those 10 countries about the reasons for dropout were very revealing in that respect. I mean, I was actually surprised by the differences sometimes between countries, right? So I would say, I mean, I think it's useful to have some broadcasts to convince people it matters economically, right? Apart from mattering for the girls. But I think what is the most useful work probably is the more detailed work at the country level in terms of what are the particular conditions and what can help in that specific country, right? I mean, So even academically, right? I mean, sometimes it's harder to publish those things, but I think it matters a bit more. And so again, I want to say that, I mean, Suzanne mentioned that there are issues of the Journal of Adolescent Health coming up on that, but there's a lot of reviews. I mean, RCRW has done some, the bank has done some, we are doing now also background papers for regional strategies on education that will discuss this. I mean, the Population Center did a review of the evidence as well. So there's a lot of material out there. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm sure you can find many of those, and they can help you in your own thinking. But if you do country work, you really have to be careful understanding what's the constraint in your specific country. Yeah.
Sure. So thanks a lot. Do I see any other mic unmuted for any questions? Great. So Bahe, I think we can now say a big thank you to our presenter today, the subject matter expert. I think Quentin, it was like I learned a lot. It was very a learning experience for me. And on behalf of the team, the group, and all the people who are really looking forward to this learning, this video, this has been recorded. It will be available to widely. We will be actually sharing and making a big thanks to you. Have a great day, great weekend. It's night in India, so happy weekend as well. So thanks to everybody for their participation and listening to us. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Quentin. Thank you, Sushmita. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Quentin, as a host, you